Before we begin, I thought it would be fun if everyone lets me know in the comments where they're watching this video from. And while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's start today's episode. Christine Kupka. Christine Kupka was a dedicated honor student at Baruch College in New York, pursuing a degree in philosophy. To support herself, she worked as a server at a Jamaican restaurant in 1998 and shared a home with 5 roommates. During her time at the college, she became acquainted with Darshanan Persad, an adjunct chemistry professor of Indo-Guyanese descent. After completing his class, the two began dating and were in a relationship for 5 months. Eventually, Darshanan learned that Christine was 5 months pregnant. Desperate for her to terminate the pregnancy, he repeatedly urged her to have an abortion, but she refused. On October 24, 1998, Christine left her residence on Westminster Avenue in New York City around 12:30 p.m. and never returned. According to her roommate, Darshanan had arrived at their home shortly before she left. She recalled that he appeared anxious. Before leaving, Christine left a message on her sister's answering machine, stating that she was going with Darshanan to see his new apartment and would be back soon. However, she was never seen again. Her family later informed the police that her relationship with Darshanan had been troubled. They revealed that after he learned about the pregnancy, Christine grew fearful that he might harm her or the baby, though she never explicitly said he had threatened her. It was later discovered that Darshanan was married, a fact he reportedly only disclosed to Christine after she became pregnant. However, at the time the baby was conceived, he had not yet been married. Initially, he denied paternity, claiming he had undergone a partial vasectomy, but he later withdrew this statement. According to Christine's family and friends, Darshanan was both angry and afraid, expressing concerns that his family would disown him if they found out about the pregnancy. He feared being cast out by both his family and his community. Darshanan was a Guyanese immigrant, and his father served as a Hindu priest. Christine had reportedly spoken to Darshanan's wife on multiple occasions, having first contacted her while trying to reach him through his pager. During their conversations, Christine assured his wife that she had no intention of disrupting their family but wanted Darshanan to take responsibility for their child. Upon learning of Christine's pregnancy, his wife was said to have reacted with anger toward him. Christine planned to list Darshanan as the father on the baby's birth certificate and intended to seek financial support from him if necessary. After learning this, Darshanan distanced himself from her for some time, but eventually reappeared in her life shortly before she went missing. He claimed that his family had disowned him and that he was staying with a cousin. During this period, he seemingly embraced the pregnancy, suggesting baby names and even offering to be a birthing coach. However, after Christine's roommate reported her missing on October 25th, her family tracked down Darshanan's residence, only to discover that he was still living there and had never been thrown out as he had claimed. The family confronted him about Christine's whereabouts, and the police were called in. Darshanan told the police that he had driven Christine to a shopping center and then waited in his car for her to return from shopping. After finishing her shopping, he said he dropped Christine off 2 blocks from her house between 3 o'clock and 4 p.m. as she wanted to walk to a nearby health food store. When Christine's family asked him which shopping mall he had taken her to, he said he did not know. Christine's family then questioned around the neighborhood. A laundromat owner came forward and said that he had seen her walking past the establishment, and the owner of the area health food store said she might have seen her at approximately 7 p.m. the day of her disappearance, but would later change her story and said the woman was not Christine since the woman wore peach-colored pants which Christine did not own. Authorities called in Darshanan, but he appeared before the detectives in the presence of his attorney and refused to answer any questions. The family hired an investigator, and he believes that Darshanan is involved in her disappearance. There is no actual evidence linking Darshanan to Christine's disappearance and probable murder. No witnesses, no confessions, no physical evidence. The circumstances surrounding Christine's disappearance remain unresolved. Authorities noted that while Darshanan was cooperative during his single interview, he did not have an alibi for the time she vanished. Despite this, he has never been charged in connection with the case and continues to assert his innocence. He now resides in Florida, works as a dentist, and remains married. In 2010, investigators began excavating the basement floor of a shop that had once belonged to one of Darshanan's relatives. A section of the concrete appeared different from the rest, and a cadaver dog signaled the possible presence of human remains. However, no evidence was ever discovered. To this day, Christine remains missing. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's move on with the video. Moving on to the next case. Donna Graybill. In 1995, Donna Graybill endured relentless harassment in the form of non-stop phone calls. For 6 months, in Billerica, Massachusetts, she waited as her phone rang every 90 minutes, day and night, totaling no fewer than 2,688 calls. Each time she answered, she was met with nothing but a rush of air, followed by a click and a dial tone. There was never anyone on the other end. Desperate for answers, Donna reached out to the local police, who traced the calls to a home in suburban Potomac belonging to Feuder and Elizabeth James. However, the Jameses were completely innocent, and the real culprit turned out to be something far more unusual: a heating oil tank in their basement. The tank had not been in use for years, but its original manufacturer, Stewart Petroleum, had installed an auto-dialing device designed to call the company when the oil level was low. Malfunctioning after nearly a decade, the device had been repeatedly dialing Donna's number by mistake. The number was disconnected, but in February of 1995, Donna Graybill set up her own 800 number for a business she ran from her home. She got the same number Stewart Petroleum once used to receive calls from their auto-dialing device. Shortly thereafter, the device on the oil tank reactivated and started making a non-stop series of calls to Graybill's residence. Nobody is certain what brought the oil tank to life. Harold Herman, a Bell Atlantic cable maintenance supervisor who traced the calls, said it might have been a power surge or a lightning strike. In the end, she was contacted over 2,000 times by an inanimate object. Moving on to the next case. Iona Soric. Iona had recently graduated high school and was awaiting university admission results while planning a vacation to Spain. On Friday, July 16th, she attended a party at a mutual friend's apartment before heading to a club in Sopot with her friend Audria and 3 acquaintances, Powell, Merrick, and Adrian. Initially, she had planned to remain at the first party, but she instead chose to accompany the 3 men she had only known for about a month. During their time at the club, an argument broke out between them, though the cause of the dispute remains unknown. According to her friends, Iona abruptly left in a hurry. CCTV footage captured her at approximately 3:45 a.m. outside Dream Club, walking barefoot with her high heels in hand. She went towards the seaside promenade. She has no money and her phone battery was running low. She waits until the dawn breaks at around 4 a.m. and starts walking in the direction of her home through the seaside boulevard. She had about 6 kilometers, 3.7 miles, to go. She texted a few people on her way, also Audria, saying she's angry that her friend didn't follow her out. Ijwana called Audria and Audria says that they settled the argument over the phone and that they were okay now. A few minutes later after 4 a.m., she calls Audria for the last time, telling her that her phone battery is dying, telling her where she is and telling her that she's heading to Audria's home, was a bit drunk and probably didn't want to meet her mom like that, and Audria's parents were away so her house was the perfect place to go. At that time, she said that she'd leave the keys outside for Ijwana to come in. She was actually standing near Ijwana's apartment at the time of the conversation, and Ijwana's stepfather heard Audria talking. The stepfather also claimed that he had heard Ijwana, but Audria says that's because she had the speakerphone on. This was the last time anyone heard from Ijwana. Ijwana was captured on CCTV walking down the seaside boulevard at 4:12 a.m. This would be the last known whereabouts of Ijwana. Her mother thought she was at Audria's. Audria thought she had gone home because the keys were still intact. They realized that something was wrong around 5 a.m. on June 17th. In the surveillance footage at the beach, it is clear that a certain distance behind the girl, there is a man in a plaid shirt with a towel on his shoulder walking. To this day, the man has not been identified. Police, at the start, made very little attempt in locating Iona. They initially thought that maybe she had gone off to party somewhere else, or stayed at some other friend's house, or had run off. The official investigation didn't begin until a week after Iona's disappearance. Despite extensive searches, none of her belongings or clothing from that night were ever recovered. Early in the investigation, around 100 individuals were questioned, but no significant leads emerged. Some theories suggest that the conversation Iona's stepfather overheard wasn't actually a phone call, but rather a face-to-face conversation. This has led to speculation that Adria and Iona met outside the apartment building and that Adria may have more information about what happened. Authorities released a composite sketch of an unidentified man seen on CCTV, but no one has come forward to identify him. The case remains unsolved. Moving on to the next case. Laura Hobbs. Two girls rode their bikes to the park and vanished, setting off a chain of events that seemed almost impossible to believe. From the start, the story played out like a detective thriller with an astonishing plot. As the situation developed, it grew more perplexing until all the mysteries finally merged into a single answer. Laura Hobbs was born on September 25, 1996, in Texas. Later, her parents had 3 sons, but their relationship eventually ended in separation. Laura's mother moved with the children to the quiet town of Zion, Illinois. She quickly grew fond of the area, as her maternal grandparents lived there, and she soon formed new friendships. Additionally, Zion was located along the shores of Lake Michigan, a place she loved visiting with her family. In February, when Laura was 8 years old, her father chose to reunite with his wife and become part of the children's lives again. He moved from Texas to live with the family. A few months later, on Sunday, May 8th, they celebrated Mother's Day. Laura, her brothers, and their parents spent the day at the lake, enjoying the occasion and flying kites. They had a wonderful time, and later, Laura wanted to take a walk with her best friend, 9-year-old Crystal. The 2 girls attended the same school and lived nearby. When Laura moved to Zion, they quickly bonded and became inseparable, spending nearly all their free time together. They would visit each other's homes, play near their houses, and ride their bikes. Whenever Laura's mother didn't allow her to go out, Crystal would come to her window, and they would chat. That day, they decided to take their bikes and ride to the park, which was just a few hundred yards from their homes. The girls often visited the park since it was nearby and featured a long bike trail. Despite their young age, their parents felt comfortable letting them go, as both were familiar with the area, and serious crimes in the town were extremely rare. They left around 3 p.m., planning to return in time for dinner. However, as the hours passed, their parents began to grow concerned. By 7 p.m., when Laura and Crystal still hadn't come home, their families decided to head to the park to call them back. To their shock, the girls were nowhere to be found. They walked along the bike path, calling their names, but there was no response. Soon, other family members joined in the search, growing more anxious with each passing moment. The search continued throughout the park and into the surrounding neighborhood streets, as family members desperately hoped to find the girls. Hours passed with no sign of them, and as darkness began to set in, concern turned to fear. By 9 p.m., the parents realized that something may have happened to Laura and Crystal, prompting them to contact the police. Law enforcement quickly joined the search efforts, enlisting the help of volunteer organizations, search dogs, and several dozen volunteers. As word spread about the missing girls, local residents also stepped in to assist. The police concentrated their search in the park, as that was where the girls had planned to go. Speaking with children who lived along the route from their homes to the park, officers confirmed that Laura and Crystal had passed by, stopping briefly to chat before continuing on their way. Meanwhile, investigators went door to door in the neighborhood, hoping someone had seen the girls that evening. They also began distributing flyers with details about their disappearance, determined to gather any possible leads. With each passing hour, the fear that something terrible had happened to the girls grew stronger. Night had fallen, and despite the town-wide search, there was no sign of Laura or Crystal. The search continued relentlessly, stretching into the early morning hours. By around 4:30 a.m., the police decided to pause briefly, but Laura's father and grandfather refused to stop. Determined to find the girls, they headed back to the park and decided to split up to cover more ground. At around 6 a.m., as the first light of dawn appeared, Laura's grandfather suddenly heard a cry and rushed toward the sound. He found Laura's father, who stood frozen in shock. He had discovered the bodies of Laura and Crystal. The girls lay hidden off the bike path, concealed by thick undergrowth. Laura's father immediately realized they were dead, as their bodies were covered in blood and showed severe injuries. Without hesitation, he called the police, who arrived swiftly to the scene. After examining the bodies, forensic experts concluded that the girls had died from multiple stab wounds, likely inflicted with a knife. Laura had suffered 20 such injuries, while Crystal had 11. The horrifying news sent shockwaves through the small town, where violent crimes were almost unheard of. Now, residents were confronted with the grim reality that an unknown attacker had brutally murdered 2 young girls just a few hundred meters from their homes. Determined to find the perpetrator, the police focused all their efforts on the investigation. Their initial suspicions fell on Laura's father, Jerry. Authorities found it suspicious that he had discovered the bodies alone, despite the park having already been searched by officers and volunteers. As they looked deeper into his past, they uncovered a troubling criminal history. Jerry had been involved in various offenses, ranging from drug-related charges in his youth to violent assaults. One particularly alarming incident had occurred in February 2001, which ultimately led to his wife taking the children and moving to another state. At the time, while they were still living in Texas, an argument between Jerry and his wife had spiraled out of control. The incident took place in front of their home when 3 passing men noticed the heated argument and stepped in, believing Jerry's wife was in danger. Enraged by their interference, Jerry ran to grab a chainsaw and began chasing them. The men eventually managed to subdue him and hold him down until the police arrived. As a result, Jerry was charged, and a year later, he was sentenced to 10 years of probation. Part of the conditions required him to check in regularly with his probation officer, but he failed to attend one of these appointments. Because of this violation, his probation was revoked, and he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. He was released just a few weeks before the tragic deaths of his daughter and her friend and had traveled to Zion almost immediately after his release. To the police, his history of aggressive behavior made him a strong suspect. However, they lacked concrete evidence or a clear motive. Instead, they invited him in for questioning. Jerry agreed to go to the station, where investigators gradually began pressing him about his possible involvement. During more than 20 hours of questioning, Jerry initially denied any involvement in the deaths of his daughter and her friend. He repeatedly insisted that he had nothing to do with it, claiming that after he and his wife realized Laura hadn't returned home, he went out searching for her. He said he continued looking until he eventually found the girls' bodies in the park. However, as the interrogation went on, his story began to change. Under relentless pressure from detectives, Jerry eventually started to confess. He claimed that on that evening, he had indeed gone to the park and seen Laura with Crystal. Angry that his daughter had gone out without permission, he scolded her and demanded that she come home with him. When Laura refused, he grabbed her arm in an attempt to take her back. She resisted, and Crystal intervened, insisting that he leave Laura alone. According to Jerry, Crystal then pulled out a small knife from her pocket and pointed it at him. Jerry flew into a rage. He seized the knife and repeatedly stabbed both girls before leaving their bodies in the overgrown section of the park and walking away. The following morning, he allegedly discovered the bodies and reported it to the police, hoping to divert suspicion away from himself. During his confession, Jerry was in tears, but he signed his admission statement and repeated it on camera. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community, leaving the girls' families devastated. No one could have imagined that Laura's own father was responsible for the horrific crime. However, his wife later told the police that she had always been aware of his violent tendencies, given his history of criminal offenses. Despite his confession, Jerry was arrested and held in prison as he awaited trial. Soon after, the prosecutor announced plans to seek the death penalty. However, as preparations for the trial dragged on, unexpected developments in the case began to emerge. Jerry was assigned a lawyer, and he abruptly changed his stance, now claiming he had nothing to do with the murders. He insisted that his confession had been coerced, given under immense pressure from detectives who had interrogated him for over 20 hours. He further alleged that the officers had threatened both him and his family, and had even subjected him to physical mistreatment. At the time, he had gone more than 2 days without sleep and was in a deeply distressed state after discovering his daughter's body, struggling to cope with his grief. According to Jerry, the police told him that if he simply confessed to the murders, they would let him go and allow him to rest. He claimed that detectives had essentially fed him the details of the crime, constructing a plausible scenario and pressuring him to repeat it. Once they had crafted a coherent narrative, they wrote it down for him to sign and instructed him to read it on camera. His attorney immediately requested a case review, but the request was quickly denied. The prosecution maintained that Jerry had confessed voluntarily and had reaffirmed his statement on video. Nevertheless, after retracting his confession, he had to go through a full-fledged trial with a jury, which prolonged his wait for several years. Following this, Jerry's lawyer discovered some significant details. Initially, he knew that there wasn't a single real piece of evidence against his client, and decided to focus on searching for any leads. Here, he found out that the medical examiners had not even thoroughly examined the bodies of the girls. They had conducted all the standard procedures, like taking swabs, collecting debris from under the girls' fingernails, and so on. However, after storing these samples in the refrigerator, no one had considered analyzing their contents. The lawyer pushed to have all these pieces of evidence examined in an independent laboratory. The prosecution tried to obstruct his efforts, but he succeeded in his. In February 2008, the examinations were finally conducted, and there was a rather unexpected twist. It turned out that Laura's body had several different DNA samples on it. There was foreign skin under her fingernails, and male semen found on her clothes and in 3 places on her body. Simple analysis revealed that none of this belonged to Laura's father. It all pointed to a completely different man. This discovery unequivocally indicated that Laura had been sexually assaulted. As for Crystal, they did not find any foreign DNA on her body, but no one doubted that she was killed by the same person. Jerry's lawyer immediately requested his client's release from prison and the dismissal of all charges. However, District Prosecutor refused to acknowledge the new evidence, claiming that it meant nothing. In his opinion, the presence of foreign DNA on Laura's body could have been entirely coincidental. He argued that young couples regularly visited that park for intimate encounters, and he believed that this was why male semen ended up on the girl's body, possibly from the grass or bushes. Even the fact that some biological samples were found inside the victim's body didn't seem to faze him. Despite the absurdity of this version, Jerry remained in prison, awaiting the start of his trial. Nevertheless, the lawyer managed to get the DNA sample entered into the FBI's database. But there were no matches. All he could do was wait and hope that the perpetrator would be caught sooner or later, because there was no hope for reasonableness from the prosecution's side in Jerry's case. Let's fast forward 4 years and miles away from Zion. A 20-year-old woman named Amanda Snell, who had recently joined the military, lived in the military base in Arlington, Virginia. She decided to enlist because there were many military members in her family. Alongside her service, she occasionally helped a local church near the base. There, she taught children with autism and other developmental differences. Amanda quickly realized that she wanted to pursue this professionally, and planned to get the necessary education after her military service. On July 13, 2009, she didn't report for duty, immediately raising concerns among her fellow service members. They went to a room, knocked on the door, but received no response. They discovered that the door was unlocked and entered. The room was impeccably tidy. The bed was made, and her belongings were neatly in place. But Amanda was nowhere to be found. Only after they opened the closet did they come across a horrifying sight. Amanda's lifeless body lay in an unnatural position with a pillowcase over her head. Initially, the medical examiners couldn't determine the cause of death, but they later concluded that Amanda died of suffocation. Her death had occurred over a day before her body was discovered. There were no signs of trauma on Amanda's body, nor was there any evidence of sexual assault. The only notable detail investigators discovered was that her laptop and tablet were missing from her room. When speaking with Amanda's parents, detectives learned an interesting fact. She suffered from severe headaches, and when the pain became unbearable, she would sometimes retreat to a dark room and cover her head with a pillowcase. Given that Amanda was found in her closet with a pillowcase over her head, investigators considered the possibility that her death had been a tragic accident. However, they didn't rule out the possibility of murder. Near the entrance of her closet, they found a men's shoe print, but they were unable to determine who it belonged to. With no definitive answers, the investigation remained open as detectives continued searching for a potential suspect. Then, in February 2010, a 26-year-old woman from Arlington exited a metro station and began walking toward her boyfriend's home. As she made her way down the street, a stranger suddenly approached her, brandished a gun, and ordered her to get into his car. Despite the assailant grabbing her arm and brandishing a knife, the woman managed to break free. She threw her purse as a distraction and fled toward her boyfriend's house. Upon hearing her cries, he and his friends rushed onto the street and called the police. By the time they did, the assailant had already fled. Nevertheless, the woman could provide a detailed description of his appearance. She also remembered the model of his car, a beige Dodge Durango. Based on the victim's description, a composite sketch of the suspect was created, and the police began their search. 2 weeks later, on February 27th, 2 women from Arlington were returning home after spending the evening with friends. When they stood at their doorstep, an unknown man approached from behind, brandishing a gun, and demanded their wallets. After the women informed him they had no money, the assailant forced them inside the house and bound their hands. At one point he left the room, and one of the women managed to free her hands. She grabbed a phone and dialed 911. However, the man swiftly returned, snatched the phone, and smashed it against the wall. Subsequently, he grabbed one of the women, took her out to his car, and drove away. After covering some distance, he raped her, taped her head with duct tape, and strangled her with a scarf until she lost consciousness. She later regained consciousness in the snow by the side of the road when passers-by found her. She was taken to the hospital, where the police promptly arrived. The woman provided them with a description of the attacker, and mentioned the model of his car, a beige Dodge Durango. Remarkably, just 2 hours before this attack, another woman had reported to the police. She told them that a man matching the same description and driving the same type of car had approached her on the street. He had attempted to coerce her into his vehicle, but she had used her stun gun on him and managed to escape. Investigators realized that they were dealing with a serial and highly dangerous criminal right in their midst. They focused their efforts on the vehicle, as it was easier to trace through databases. The police visited all owners of such cars, and soon they got lucky. During the inspection of one of these vehicles, they discovered a student ID belonging to the same woman who had been left to die in the snow, along with her earring. Inside the car, they also found the same type of tape used to bind her head and a stun gun. The owner of the car turned out to be a 21-year-old named Jorge Avila Torres, who was serving in the military at the very base where Amanda Snell's body had been found several months earlier. Moreover, he lived in the same building as her, just a few floors below. During the search of his room, investigators found a pistol he had purchased less than a month ago, along with numerous rounds of ammunition. On his computer they discovered a significant amount of explicit videos depicting violence and cruelty. Some of these videos featured women who were unconscious. Photos of Torres, along with pictures of other men, were shown to all 3 women who had been attacked. They all unanimously identified him. They his face well because during the assaults, he didn't even attempt to conceal it. Following this, Torres was arrested and placed in custody pending trial. Investigators suspected him of kidnapping one woman and assaulting 2 others, which seemed likely given the evidence. However, they faced another problem when they began to suspect Torres of Amanda's murder. There wasn't a single piece of evidence linking him to the crime. So, detectives devised a clever plan. They planted an informant in his cell, someone willing to wear a wire and engage him in conversation. Surprisingly, this tactic worked remarkably fast. Within a week, Torres started confessing to his crimes. He openly boasted about killing Amanda, stating he did it just because the opportunity presented itself. He added that he did it for the adrenaline, and provided a detailed account of how he placed her body in the closet. Torres also mentioned that after the murder, he had to meticulously clean her room to erase any traces. However, unknowingly, he left behind a piece of evidence during the cleanup. The criminal revealed to his cellmate that he had sexually assaulted the victim on her bed, using contraception. After moving her to the closet, Torres made her bed but removed the top sheet. However, he left the mattress pad, which the police immediately sent to the laboratory. Their experts found a tiny sample of male semen that matched Torres's DNA perfectly. Furthermore, Torres let slip to his informant that he had a pair of Nike sneakers that he kept in his car. Crime scene analysts seized the shoes and compared the sole pattern to the footprint found outside Amanda's closet. The sole pattern was an exact match. As a result, Torres was formally charged with murder, and he remained in custody awaiting trial. Meanwhile, a sample of his DNA had been uploaded to the FBI's database. And now, we return to Zion. Several weeks after the sample was added to the database, local investigators got a perfect match between Torres's DNA and the semen samples found on Laura Hobbs's body. What followed was even more astonishing. It turned out that Torres was originally from Zion and was friends with the older brother of the second murdered girl, Crystal. This connection confirmed that both Laura and Crystal knew Torres, a fact corroborated by other kids in the area. At the time of the girls' deaths, Torres was just 16, and the police hadn't considered him a suspect at all. They were solely focused on Laura's father, who had spent 5 years in jail awaiting trial. Once the DNA match was found, Jerry's attorney demanded his client's immediate release, and the dropping of all charges. This time the prosecutor couldn't argue against it, as the discovery of Torres's semen on Laura's body eliminated the possibility of her father's involvement. After his release, Jerry announced his intention to sue the police and authorities for coercing a false confession from him and making him spend 5 years of imprisonment. They quickly realized they had no chance of winning this case, and in the event of a loss, they'd be held accountable for their misconduct and incompetence. So, they offered him a settlement, which he accepted, receiving nearly $8 million. As for Torres, the legal process in Virginia concluded 4 years after his arrest. He refused to admit guilt, but the jury unanimously found him guilty. He was sentenced to death for Amanda's murder, and for the attempted abduction of 2 other women, and the kidnapping of a third. He received 5 life sentences, plus 168 years in prison. Immediately after this, he was extradited to Illinois, where the trial for the murders of Laura and Crystal began. Initially, he denied his guilt, and his lawyer tried to argue that the semen found on the victim wasn't enough to prove his client's guilt. However, Torres was eventually presented with a deal. He was already facing the death penalty, and even if that were delayed for decades, as it often happens, he would never walk free. So, the criminal agreed to confess to the murders in exchange for an additional 100 years in prison and a transfer to a different facility, as he felt his life was in danger at his current one. The terms of the deal didn't require him to reveal all the details. It was sufficient for him to admit to the killings. As a result, Torres remains behind bars, awaiting the execution that has yet to occur. As for the police officers who coerced Jerry into signing a false confession, none of them faced any consequences. Jerry himself couldn't fully return to a normal life. He began using drugs and was arrested for resisting arrest, subsequently escaping from custody and receiving a 2-year prison sentence. He also couldn't reunite with his family, and chose to live in Texas, After his release, Jerry gave an interview in which he admitted that the coerced confession had irreparably damaged his life. When asked why he had agreed to confess, he responded, "I found my daughter dead. They didn't even need to try to break me. I was already broken." Ultimately, both the local police and the county prosecutor's office faced well-deserved criticism from the national media and the public. Had they not fixated on a single suspect and instead conducted a thorough investigation, they would have had a far greater chance of catching the real perpetrator much sooner. Instead, their tunnel vision inadvertently allowed the killer to take another woman's life and attack 3 more victims, and those are just the cases that came to light. Moving on to the next case. Mikaela Garrett. Mikaela Garrett, just 9 years old, awoke unusually early at 5 a.m. to write a poem. The people knock on doors of steel. The people knock. The people kneel. They think of things that aren't real. Outside those doors of steel. The people walk. The people know. That outside those doors, the people know. The people think that you may say, the people think that they too may. They lack the confidence you have, they think it's real, the dreams you have, the dreams they feel. Her mother, Sharon Murch, found the poem unsettling, especially considering Mikaela was typically a cheerful child. When asked about it, Mikaela explained that she had woken up after hearing noises in the attic and had written about people who had been kidnapped and were trapped there. Curious, her mother questioned her further, particularly about the people outside the steel doors, assuming they referred to the captors standing outside rather than the victims inside. However, Mikaela remained vague and offered no further explanation, leaving her mother puzzled. Later that week, on November 19, 1988, Mikaela and her friend Katrina Rodriguez rode their scooters to Rainbow Market, a local convenience store they often visited, located on Mission Boulevard near Lafayette Avenue in Hayward. They arrived around 10 a.m., picked up some snacks, and then absent-mindedly began walking home, forgetting they had ridden their scooters. Realizing their mistake, they turned back at approximately 10:15 a.m. to retrieve them. However, Mikaela's scooter had mysteriously been moved and was now leaning against a light-colored car. As she bent down to grab it by the handlebars, a blond man with pockmarks or facial scarring suddenly grabbed her by the waist and forced her into his vehicle. Mikaela's friend immediately ran back into the convenience store and alerted the clerk, who rushed outside to help, but it was already too late. In the confusion following the abduction, the store owner mistakenly provided police with an incorrect description, leading authorities and the public to search for a burgundy car driven by a mustached man with brown hair. It wasn't until Mikaela's friend was formally interviewed by police that the correct description was released: a tan or light-colored car driven by a clean-shaven man with long, scraggly blonde hair. Unfortunately, nearly 48 crucial hours had already passed. Over 15,000 tips poured into police and FBI offices, including numerous false leads. One of the most deceptive claims came from inmate Roger Haggard, who insisted he had buried Mikaela's body in San Francisco's Hunters Point neighborhood. Investigators flew him out to pinpoint the location, only for him to make them dig aimlessly for 8 hours before admitting he had fabricated the story, supposedly to give the family closure. An additional 6.5 years were added to Roger Haggard's sentence for making false statements and inflicting unnecessary distress on Mikaela's family. Given the Bay Area's high population density, the region had no shortage of sex offenders and high-profile murder cases. The FBI meticulously investigated past offenders, particularly the speed freak killers and the kidnappers of J.C. Lee Dugard, but found no evidence linking them to Mikaela's disappearance. At one point, a bone fragment discovered at a burial site associated with the speed freak killers was suspected to belong to Mikaela. However, DNA testing in 2012 confirmed it was unrelated. Even long after Mikaela's case faded from the headlines, her mother remained relentless, tirelessly distributing flyers and tying yellow ribbons around the Hayward neighborhood where her daughter had vanished. Her mother, Sharon, never stopped working and searching. She copied her daughter's missing child flyers thousands of times with the hopes that someone knew something and would come forward. Mikaela's mother keeps a blog called Dear Mikaela where she posts updates on her life and on the case in the form of letters to her missing daughter. Her heartbreak and frustration at the lack of progress in the case is palpable, and she ends one of her more recent blog posts before she received any updates in the case with these heartbreaking words: "I love you, baby girl, forever and ever. Remember, I am always in your heart. When you walk into a dark room, if you reach out your hand, I will always be there to hold it." Now, authorities in Alameda County have finally found their suspect. David Emery Mish appeared in Superior Court of California on Tuesday, December 22, 2020 to face charges of murder during a kidnapping with special circumstances. After re-examining evidence from the case, which was over 3 decades old now, detectives gave a fingerprint examiner a series of names of people of interest. On that list was David Michigan. Although they did not disclose why he was a person of interest specifically, looking at the track record of his previous convictions for the 1989 murder of a Hayward woman combined with the fact that he has been recently charged with 2 counts of murder in the brutal killing of 2 Fremont women in 1986, he would be a prime suspect as the timing and target females matched up. Diligent police work and investigation led to the realization that the palm prints on the handlebars and the fork of Mikaela's scooter, the very scooter she had returned to retrieve when she was violently grabbed by the waist and pulled into a car, matched those of David Emery Mish. Mish has been incarcerated since 1990. He was previously convicted for the 1989 murder of a woman also from Hayward, and because of his history of violence and the circumstances surrounding this case, he is eligible for the death penalty. He is being held in Santa Rita Jail in Alameda County. In reviewing the description of the suspect given by eyewitnesses more than 30 years ago, and in looking at his most published picture, the long, scraggly and unkempt blonde hair stands out as an immediate and unique identifier. Police disclosed that 2 eyewitnesses to the people present in the parking lot minutes prior to Mikaela's abduction picked the beleaguered and aged 59-year-old David Minch out of a photo lineup. Robert Purnell, one of the lead detectives on the case and the reporting officer on the arrest records, said that the suspect had a number of connections to the Hayward area. He was transient at times, bouncing in and out of Hayward hotels. Upon hearing the news of this major turn in the investigation told to her via Zoom, with detectives holding up a high-quality color photograph of a man that she had never seen and did not recognize, Mikaela's mother updated the public through her beautifully written and extensive blog and reacted poignantly to this news with words that are both heartbreaking and poetic. She writes, quote, "While I have envisioned Mikaela as not living in this world, she was always in a good place. I have seen her floating on clouds, running in grass meadows. I have literally envisioned the 2 of us sitting on stars in eternity, drinking tea and chatting in a place where all the horrors of this life faded into insignificance in the greater whole. Now for some reason I can no longer see those places. I can only see my child cold and alone. I feel like I abandoned her, chasing a dead-end lead when I should have been by her side all along." The suspect, acting out of sheer selfishness, refused to cooperate with detectives during their interaction on December 2, 2020. He declined to provide a DNA sample or answer any questions. While no further details have been disclosed, it is presumed that a court-ordered subpoena and additional testing are in progress. Tragically, the suspect has not revealed the location of Mikaela's remains. However, investigators remain determined to bring closure to her family and are planning further interviews in hopes of recovering this innocent child's body. Until then, a grieving mother, longing for nothing more than to sit with her daughter, sip tea, and share a conversation, continues her search for answers. She holds on to hope that some greater force will one day reunite them. If you have any information regarding this ongoing murder investigation or recognize this individual from the time of Mikaela's disappearance, please contact the Hayward Police Department at 510-293-7272. Moving on to the next case. New Bedford Highway Killer. The New Bedford Highway Killer is the name given to an unidentified serial murderer responsible for 9 confirmed deaths and 2 disappearances over the course of a year, from March 1988 to April 1989. The victims were all women, many of whom were either involved in sex work, struggling with substance abuse, or both. Most were last seen in New Bedford, Massachusetts, before their bodies were discovered in various surrounding towns along Route 140. The earliest known victim was 29-year-old Robin Lynn Rhodes, also known as Bobby Lynn. Her remains were found on March 29, 1989, but she had gone missing nearly a year earlier, around March or April 1988. Robin left behind a young child. While she was not a sex worker, she had a history of drug addiction and was acquainted with several other victims, including her friend Mary Rose Santos. Additionally, Robin had dated one of the case's primary suspects, Kenneth Ponte. Mary Rose Santos was last seen by her family on July 16, 1988, when her husband dropped her off near the New Bedford downtown bus station. About 5 hours later, she was reportedly spotted dancing at the Old Quarterdeck Lounge. She never returned home that night, and on March 31, 1989, her body was discovered along Route 88 in Westport. She had been left nude, further reinforcing the disturbing pattern of the case. Mary had struggled with drug addiction and had engaged in sex work, though she had recently reconciled with her husband after he learned about how she had been making money. Chillingly, Kenneth Ponte, the same man who had dated Robin Rhodes, had once served as Mary's legal representative in a civil case. Even more disturbingly, he helped Mary's husband make missing person flyers following her disappearance. Shortly after Robin's disappearance, another woman, 28-year-old Rochelle Clifford Dopiorala, vanished in April 1988. Rochelle, who was from Falmouth, Massachusetts, was last seen in the company of an ex-convict, who happened to be the boyfriend of another victim. However, authorities eventually ruled him out as a suspect in both cases. 8 months later, on December 10, 1988, Rochelle's remains were found along Reed Road, just 2 miles from Interstate 195. Once again, there was a connection to Kenneth Ponte. Rochelle had briefly dated him and had even stayed at his house. Investigators also considered another potential suspect, a man whom Rochelle had testified against in a rape case. This led police to believe her murder could have been an act of retaliation, but he was ultimately cleared of any involvement. Interestingly, Kenneth Ponte had also represented Rochelle Dopiorala during the rape case in which she testified. In May 1988, just 1 month after Rochelle's disappearance, 3 more women went missing. The first was 25-year-old Deborah Lynn McConnell, who was last seen attending her mother's funeral. She was a young mother herself, and after vanishing, she remained missing for 7 months. In December 1988, her body was finally discovered off Route 140, discarded in the undergrowth. Like previous victims, she was found nude, with a bra wrapped around her neck, a disturbing detail that suggested a pattern in the killer's method. The second woman to go missing in May 1988 was 29-year-old Deborah Medeiros, who was reported missing on May 27. Deborah struggled with drug addiction and was known to police due to past issues. Although she lived with her mother in Fall River, she disappeared from New Bedford following a heated argument with her boyfriend. Her remains were the first to be discovered in the case. In July 1988, her badly decomposed body was found on the side of the road along Interstate 40 in Freetown. Like Deborah McConnell, she had been found with a bra wrapped around her neck, further reinforcing the suspicion that the same perpetrator was behind these killings. She was partially undressed, and her cause of death was confirmed as strangulation. Investigators ruled out Deborah's boyfriend as a suspect. The last woman to disappear in May 1988 was 19-year-old Christina Montero. Like several other victims, she battled drug addiction and left behind a young child when she failed to return home. Unlike most of the other women, Christina's remains have never been recovered. To this day, she is still considered missing. Her family last had contact with her in May or June 1988, though some reports suggest she was last seen in July. She vanished from New Bedford and is believed to be another victim of the New Bedford highway killer. Similarly, Marilyn Roberts, another victim, has also never been found. Marilyn was 34 years old when she disappeared from New Bedford. The last confirmed contact with her was in April 1988, though there were reports that she was seen 2 months later in June. 36-year-old Nancy Lee Piva went missing on July 7 after leaving Whispers pub following an argument with her boyfriend, which led her to walk home alone. She struggled with substance abuse, and her boyfriend at the time was a known drug dealer with a history of police encounters. Their relationship was reportedly troubled, with allegations of domestic violence. Despite this, when Nancy's body was discovered on July 30th, her boyfriend was quickly ruled out as a suspect. Her remains were found nude near the westbound side of Interstate 195 in Dartmouth, and her cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Another victim, 35-year-old Deborah Greenlaw DeMello, a mother of 3 with a history of drug abuse, was last seen on July 11th after walking away from a prison work release program. She had been serving time due to charges related to sex work. Her body was found on November 8th near the eastbound Reed Road ramp off Interstate 195. Investigators noted that her clothing had been draped over nearby tree branches, and shockingly, they also found personal belongings belonging to Nancy Piva close to the scene. Sandra Botello, a 24-year-old mother of 2, was the second-to-last known victim of the New Bedford highway killer. She struggled with severe drug addiction and had a history of involvement in sex work. The last time she was seen was on August 11th, after leaving her home. Her body was the final one to be discovered, found in April 1989 in a wooded area along Interstate 195. She was nude, and her body had been positioned in a fetal posture. The last confirmed victim was 25-year-old Dawn Mendez, who disappeared on September 4, 1988. She had been walking home alone from work to attend a christening party when she vanished. Like Sandra, Dawn had a history of drug addiction and sex work. Her remains, mostly skeletal by the time of discovery, were found on November 29th near the westbound Reed Road ramp off Interstate 195. Over the years, multiple individuals have been considered suspects in connection with the New Bedford highway killer. The 2 most prominent ones are Kenneth Ponte and Anthony DeGrazia. DeGrazia was a 26-year-old construction worker in 1989 who reportedly had a reputation for violence. His image was shown to a sex worker in the New Bedford area who believed he looked like a man who tried to choke her. Both her assailant and DeGrazia had a flattened nose, and she recalled that he'd called himself Tony. Still, she was not able to make a positive ID. The sex worker was brought in front of a secret grand jury to testify about her assault a short time later. She explained that Anthony DeGrazia looked similar to her attacker, and that a man named Tony lunged at her throat and tried snapping her neck. He then, quote, told me what he was going to do to me like he did to the other bitches. On the back of her testimony, authorities located DeGrazia and brought him in for questioning. Like Margaret, he was put before the secret grand jury, but he was never indicted. The DA at the time later asked for a warrant for his arrest, accusing DeGrazia of 17 attempted rapes and assaults on several local sex workers. DeGrazia turned himself in where he was arrested for those charges. He spent 13 months in jail and made 18 court appearances. His lawyers repeatedly asked for documents of evidence, but were denied every time. Similarly, his lawyers asked for his bail to be lowered as it was considered to be much too high. However, the judge declined. Finally, DeGrazia hired a new lawyer who filed a contempt on the DA's office for non-production of evidence, and the judge subsequently lowered DeGrazia's bail amounts, allowing him to be released on June 27, 1990. He was shortly thereafter rearrested for allegedly making threats against the life of the DA who'd had him arrested, Ronald Pena, but DeGrazia made bail and was released once more. 1 month later, on July 17th, he was found dead at the house of his ex-girlfriend's parents. His death was initially considered a homicide by the police who attended the scene, but the DA's office later ruled the case suicide, even though the post-mortem did not support this ruling. Notably, DeGrazia's demise followed an announcement he was the new suspect in the New Bedford highway slayings after Kenneth Ponte, the previous #1 suspect, was released. Despite the media circus surrounding DeGrazia, there is nothing to tie him to the New Bedford highway murders at this time. Meanwhile, attorney Kenneth Ponte had several links to the case. He dated the first victim, Robin Rhodes, as well as Rochelle, and represented 3 other victims in civil cases. Furthermore, he had a history of drug use. He'd been a heroin addict before managing to turn his life around. In the book, Shallow Graves, The Hunt for the New Bedford Highway Serial Killer, Maureen Boyle wrote, quote, "The girls on the streets told stories about Ponte's paranoia, how he would bring them to his house, bolt the doors, and wouldn't let them leave. He didn't seem violent, just really strange." In August 1990, a grand jury indicted the 40-year-old in the murder of Rochelle, who was found to have been beaten to death. The DA, Ronald Pena, the same one who requested a warrant for Anthony DeGrazia's arrest, proposed the theory that Ponte had killed Rochelle because she was supposedly planning to expose his drug activities. Ponte was arraigned on 1 count of murder on August 17, to which he pleaded not guilty. Around 1 year later, in July 1991, the DA dropped the murder charges against him, noting a lack of evidence. In 1992, the remaining charges against him, which consisted of drug use and an assault against Rochelle, were dropped also. The case against Ponte lay dormant for years until February 2007, when investigators re-examined the murders and began looking into him once more. They dug up the driveway and patio of his former home in New Bedford, but found no evidence tying him to the case. Marilyn Roberts' father said, quote, "It's hope anyway upon seeing the investigation active again." Unfortunately, any hope of progress in the case was short-lived, as no new evidence surfaced following this investigation. Ponte stated that being associated with the murders had destroyed both his life and career, lamenting, "When I walk up or down any street, little kids call me a murderer." In 2007, during a heated argument with his mother and sister, he allegedly threatened to kill them and then take his own life. 3 years later, at the age of 60, he was found dead. Authorities ruled out foul play in his passing. The case remains unsolved. If you have any information regarding the New Bedford Highway killings or the identity of the perpetrator, you can reach the Bristol County District Attorney's Office at 508-993-2016. Additionally, if you have any details about the missing women, Christina Montero or Marilyn Roberts, you can contact the New Bedford Police Department at 508-991-6320. Stacy the Grand Champ. 17-year-old Stacy LeGrand Champ lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and was a student at Wayne High School. She had aspirations of attending Ball State University and pursuing a career as a computer technologist. On August 15, 2002, Stacy attended a party with her friends. At some point during the night, she got into an altercation with another girl named Harley Bovar. This was unusual for Stacy, as she had no history of fighting or being involved in conflicts. The confrontation was broken up by others at the party, but later in the evening, another fight erupted between the two. During the second altercation, Stacy suddenly stepped back and collapsed to the ground. Onlookers quickly realized that her clothes were soaked in blood. The police were called immediately. When Fort Wayne police arrived at the scene, they discovered that Stacy had been stabbed. Tragically, she succumbed to her injuries. While the case initially seemed straightforward, there was no solid evidence linking Holly to Stacy's death. Holly was brought in for questioning and stated that the altercation began because Stacy had been rude to one of her friends, leading to an argument that escalated. She denied having a knife or using one that night. Holly even suggested that Stacy may have fallen onto something sharp when she was pushed into a recycling bin. Shortly after the incident, Holly moved to Wisconsin. Despite investigators pursuing multiple leads, the case eventually went cold. However, in 2019, Fort Wayne police decided to reopen the investigation. They decided to interview all the witnesses again. This time they got a lot more information and would go on to help them to solve the case after so many years. After the new information, the investigators decided to interview Holly again. They talked to her for over 2 hours. Investigators told her the evidence they had against her. The day after the incident, Holly approached the maintenance man at her apartment complex, inquiring about how quickly she could break her lease if she needed to leave immediately. She also asked whether a knife used in a crime could be traced back to the scene based solely on its measurements. Witnesses from the party later came forward with suspicious details. One person claimed they had seen Holly place a knife beside a car outside, while another recalled seeing her wash her hands after the fight. Confronted with mounting evidence, Holly ultimately decided to confess. She still had the knife she had used and handed it over to investigators. Forensic analysis confirmed that it was the weapon responsible for Stacy's stabbing. In March 2020, Holly was arrested. Stacy's family was relieved to finally see justice being served after years of uncertainty. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.